Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this brief webinar on the Success Probability Index. This is a new indice that's going to be integrated into all of the various systems using the ORS and SRS. That includes fitoutcomes.com, myoutcomes.com, and the OpenFit app. Let's begin to talk then about where our field has been. For most of its history, this is the question that has preoccupied research and clinical discourse. Is this treatment that we're doing the right one, and are we doing it correctly? As such, emphasis has been placed on the diagnosis a person has so that we can get the evidence-based treatment that will best ensure the client's engagement and ultimate effectiveness in care. After 50 years of research, here's what we can conclude. It did neither. It neither improved the engagement nor improved outcome, but has dominated clinical and professional discourse for decades. Effectiveness rates and dropout rates have basically stayed the same for 50 years, right up to today. And what is that effectiveness? It's about 50-50. So when a client enters care, there's a 50% probability that they will be reliably changed. That's greater than chance, greater than maturation, greater than measurement error by the end of care. And by the way, that is from the world's most tested treatment approach, cognitive behavioral therapy, and drawn from randomized clinical trials. Now, we all have cases that either drop out or don't make improvement. That's part of the 50%. And of course, that's what I think many of us are interested in, is what keeps us up at night. It's what we wonder about when they leave our office. But the current way of conceptualizing treatment hasn't enabled us to really know with any degree of accuracy whether or not the client is improving. And so beginning in the mid and to late 90s, several researchers began talking about something called routine outcome monitoring. Mike Lambert was one of the chief people who was leading this. It's because he had had a supervisor named Alan Bergen. You may know that name. That person was one of the editors of the original editions of the Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change, who was really obsessed with this topic of failure in psychotherapy. He was puzzled why we mostly talked about our successes and the positives about treatment, but neglected to talk about clients who either didn't seem to benefit or got worse. At the time he began writing, actually, we didn't even know what the percentage was of people who weren't getting better during the treatment process. If we could find out who was benefiting, who was not, then maybe we'd be able to change what we were doing. And that's where we started. Measures like the BASIS 32, the OQ45, and a little bit later on, the ORS and SRS. And with the ORS and SRS, we were finally able to identify a bit about whether or not clients were making progress, and also using the clinical cutoff, who was likely to benefit. Clients above the cutoff at the start of care were actually at a heightened risk for deterioration, getting worse. Clients who were below the cutoff were those that were most likely to experience benefit over the time in treatment. And simply plotting the scores allowed us really for the first time to see in a measurable way whether or not the clients were getting better. Is the client improving? That was the question that was answered by routine outcome monitoring. But was it sufficient? Would the course of care actually lead to a successful outcome? It was really still a guessing game. And that's what we wanted to know. We could measure the outcome, but were they actually on track for a successful episode of care? For me, for many other researchers, we needed some way, a better way than simply measuring from visit to visit. And enter the reliable change index. This was the work of Neil Jacobson. And the idea here was to look at how much change did clients actually have to experience so that we could know that that change was due to the treatment rather than chance, rather than extra therapeutic experiences, rather than simply regression to the mean. Most clients, in other words, pick up the phone and call us when they're at their lowest ebb. The result is they can't help but get better somewhat. And we really shouldn't get credit for that kind of change. We want to know that the work that we're doing adds value to what would have happened anyway. Neil Jacobson and his colleagues were in developing this particular indice called the Reliable Change Index, and you probably remember it. In fact, many people are still using this index when trying to evaluate effective care. Early on in the work with the ORS and SRS, we reported that a change of 5 points from start to finish was an indication that the changes measured were greater than chance, greater than maturation, in other words, the passage of time, and greater than measurement error. But of course, there was a real problem. Actually, there were multiple problems with using the RCI. One of the problems was, and probably the biggest one, is it's an average. It's an average. It would be like giving everybody the same shoe size based on the average shoe size of the people around them. 5 points actually overestimates the amount of change that has to take place for people who are scoring higher on the ORS at intake, and it underestimates the amount of change for people who score much lower at intake. In addition, the RCI really wasn't intended to provide session by session feedback. It was more a measure developed for research designed to say whether or not the clients had actually benefited from the care offered in the randomized clinical trial. The question of, is this client on track for a successful outcome, had to give way to something else, how we're going to figure out if the client is changing enough from visit to visit so that we know at the end they've reliably changed. Beginning shortly after the ORS and SRS were first published, probably around 2002, 2003, we'd gathered enough data, 30, 40,000 cases, that we were able to publish the first trajectories of change. And we aggregated tens of thousands of cases and simply looked at the rate of change over time, depending on where the client started at the first visit. It was a reasonable advance. It's sort of similar to an IQ test. We could say whether a person was above average or below average in the amount of change they were making from session to session. Unfortunately, despite this advance, it said nothing about being on track for reliable change by the end of care. It simply said, here's how you compare to people with similar scores over the course of treatment. If somebody was at that red line you see on the graphic, the 25th percentile, did that actually mean they were at a lower chance of success by the end of care? No, because the 25% achieved a reliable change. We needed to have, again, some kind of more detailed way that had more predictive validity. Let me give you one more example about this. This is sort of like if you go to see your physician and they give you some bad news. Maybe they say that you have a survival prognosis of 60%. The question is what does that mean for you? And what does that mean about the treatment that's being provided? What you want to know is whether or not you're in the 60%, not what the overall probability of success is given the diagnosis. We were back to the drawing board, moving from the question of, is this client changing like similar clients in treatment? That's what those percentile rankings do. And many of the systems that are currently in operation are still comparing client progress to percentile rankings. But we were looking for whether or not the client was making enough change from session to session to achieve a reliable change by the end of care. We needed to know, to return to the prior example, whether or not the people were in the 60% who would survive, or whether your client was among the 50% of people who would ultimately end treatment successfully. After a fair number of analyses, the expected treatment response trajectories were developed. And this is the system that you are mostly using now in the various systems, My Outcomes, Fit Outcomes, etc. And here's the logic in the system. That green line in the trajectory is the least amount of change a person can make and still be on track for a successful outcome for someone who started at that start score. On this graph, it's a 15. So let me say it again. As long as you are at the green line, your client is making sufficient amount of change to be on track for a successful or reliable change at the end of care. If you are at the red line, that is the most amount of change a person could make and still be off track for a successful outcome by the end of care. The yellow zone is indeterminate. We can't tell whether you're on track or off track. These were the first predictive trajectories that allowed therapists working with a client to see when they needed to change up what they were doing. If your client was in the yellow or red zone, it really did mean that you should have a conversation with them because they were not making sufficient change to be on track by the end of care. These trajectories were a big advance, and they will remain in the systems that are currently in operation using the ORS and SRS for some time. But here's what these trajectories don't do. As you know from using them, they do not change after the first visit. They're static. And as a result, it assumes in many ways that what you do based on the feedback of your client being up above the green line or at or below the red line, it assumes that you do nothing to change things. And that assumption is simply incorrect. When you get the feedback, therapists tend to change. Even in the room, therapists are responding to the client in the moment. And for me, it was always a dream to have a more dynamic prediction, something that took into account the work that was done at each visit over time that helped us understand whether we were increasing the chances of a successful outcome or not. We began to think about how we could do this. And one of the issues that was for statistically for us was we needed a lot of data in order to be able to make dynamic predictions. And let me hopefully explain why. 100% of cases at the first visit turn into 50% fewer cases at the second, which turn into 50% fewer cases at the third, and so on. In other words, clients start ending care at some point. When you get out 10, 15, or 20 visits, you have a very different pool of clients than you did at the very beginning. That makes making reliable predictions very iffy until you have enough data. Now we have millions and millions of cases that have been done around the world in diverse settings that have allowed us to make better predictions as clients stay in therapy and are hopefully impacted by the work that they're doing together with their client. It's allowed us to begin to change the question again from, is this client making enough change from session to session to achieve a reliable change by the end? That's the question answered by the red, green, and yellow trajectories. To the final question, the penultimate question for me, is my work with this client at this session improving their chances of a successful outcome at the end? In other words, we're looking for a prediction that's dynamic, that takes into account not only the present session, but the prior sessions as well. And with the help of many brilliant minds, Bruce Wampold, Tak Manami, A.C. Del Rey, they have done the heavy lifting in developing this index that is currently fully implemented in My Outcomes and will be coming shortly to both OpenFit and Fit Outcomes as well. It's called the Success Probability Index. And here's what it does. It provides a prediction of the likelihood of success by the end of treatment based on both the current and historical pattern of SRS and ORS scores. Unlike the static expected treatment response or the percentile rankings, the SPI is dynamic. It's going to update at each visit. And it's designed, the whole purpose of this is to prompt clinicians to reflect on the work and act potentially earlier than they do when using the expected treatment response trajectories. The data used to generate the SPI at any given session. So how do we come up with this percentile figure? It varies depending on what is most predictive of the eventual outcome at any given session. So I will just tell you that in the beginning, the SRS scores heavily algorithm or in the formulas. Over time, the importance of the relationship variables shifts and changes on the ORS become dominant in the formulas. But that said, at each session, we're looking at this pattern, ORS and SRS. Sometimes it's the absolute number. Sometimes it's the average from the first to the current session. Sometimes it's the slope of the scores in combination to give us this percentile figure. And when you begin to use the systems, you're going to see that figure in the upper right-hand corner, at least in the implementation done by my outcomes. Let me just give you an idea about what this figure means. By S 19.62% and it's minus and it's red seems very scary. Does that mean the client only has a 19% chance of success? No. The SPI is expressed as a ratio of the individual client's predicted success over the average success rate at each session. Hang with me here as I try to explain this. Earlier, I said that the most researched model, CBT, multiple, actually hundreds of CTs done over the last few decades, the average reliable change is about 50%. And when looking at the probability of success for the total sample from session to session, hang with me, looking at our total sample, millions of cases from session to session, at any given session, the probability of success is really close to 50%. It's a coin toss at each visit for the total sample. We're trying to get specific feedback about your client, and we have it because you're administering the ORS and SRS at each session. So we're trying to improve upon a 50% success rate, if that makes sense, by having the client make changes and experience progress in their well-being, and also by tightening the client's engagement via the relationship. So 19.62% means we are nearly 20% below the average success rate for this particular client's graph. And it's also color-coded to aid in interpretation. Of course, red, kind of an international signal for stop. Let's take a moment to think about this, pause, and give this some thought. If you're within 5%, then you're going to be green. If you're within 10%, it's going to be yellow, and anything greater than 10% starting at 11, it's going to be coded in red. Why did we decide to express this as a ratio rather than give you the raw scores? In our stats, we found that the raw SPI, that is their absolute probability of success by the end of the session, never really got much higher than 70, 72, 73%. Much of the time, the client's raw SPI was closer to 60. Now think about that. 60 compared to 50 is a significant improvement over the average. But who on the call thinks that 60% sounds good? sounds like a flunking or a failing grade. So we decided to express this as a ratio comparing the raw SPI to the average success rate and saying whether you were above or below that average success rate. Let me give you an example here using two graphs that I pulled from the My Outcomes platform. And here you can see two clients that have gone both for 2 visits. The graph on the right, you can see that the SPI is red and 16% below average. The one on the left is in the green, and it's just barely above the average. That's good. Our averages are good. And you can see that the main difference here is that there's more progress in the beginning between the first and the second session. This is going to give us an opportunity, hopefully, when a client, for example, in the graphic on the right, is scoring slightly below average, for us to take a pause and ask them to reflect and think, is there anything more that we can be doing together? Take a moment before you leave and let's discuss whether or not anything was missing. So let me try to pull all of this together and offer some simple counsel or advice about how to incorporate the SPI into your work. We've had 3 developments over time: ROM, expected treatment response trajectories, and now the SPI. As you look at your graphs, the idea is not to forget what you already know about using measures and having conversations with clients around them, about interpreting the expected treatment response trajectories, the red, yellow, and green zones, and talking with clients about them. And now the SPI. Each one of these causes us to ask different kinds of questions, all of which are valid. When you look at your graph with the SPI in the top right corner, the first thing I would recommend doing is to ask yourself, do the outcome scores reflect improvement? Again, bringing in what you already know about tracking client scores from session to session, using the clinical cutoff, etc. Making sure, of course, that the client scores fall at or above the green line, and if not, having conversations with the clients about that. The second question I would suggest, after you're looking at the outcome scores, comparing them to the expected treatment responses, what do the relationship scores, the SRS in the examples that we have and in the systems that we're using, indicate regarding client engagement? You know, and I know that declining scores typically are associated with higher dropout rates and poor outcomes at the end. What does this client's pattern of scores indicate? And the last question adds in the SPI, asking what do the outcome and relationship scores in combination with the success probability index suggest about the likelihood of care resulting in a sustainable change over time and by the end of care. Here we're looking at the pattern of scores. And the numerical prediction given in the SPI can give us a sense about how much confidence we should have in our interpretation. Let me give you at least one more example of this and the application of these 3 questions. Here is a recent graph of mine, actually. And before you even look at the SPI, take a moment and think about how you might have interpreted this before we had the SPI. And then let's go to the 3 questions that I'm suggesting you ask now that you have that SPI. Do the outcome scores reflect improvement at or above the green line? The answer is no, especially in the second session, the fourth session and the fifth session. What do the relationship scores indicate regarding client engagement? As you can see, the relationship scores started at the clinical cutoff, but then have moved up slowly. So we know that our engagement is in fact solid. Then let's look at the SPI. It's been negative from the outset and below average, and with one exception, it's getting worse. In fact, this is the kind of graph that we call a hope bump, meaning that this particular client meets with us, they feel connected with us, but there's something missing in the therapy. So really, we're relying solely on hope, and that dissipates slowly over time. This is a client who would be identified as at risk for a negative outcome if we don't figure out what in the structure or care being provided is missing for them that would help them transform that hope into change over time. I think I have one more example here. Here we go. Let's think of those three questions again. What do the client scores in comparison to the TRT indicate? Is this client making change? The answer is yes. What about the relationship scores? Those have also improved fairly dramatically. And what do the combination of scores, the ORS and SRS, together with the SPI, suggest about the likelihood of care leading to a sustainable change? So in the first example, the first session rather, the client is about 16% below average. But at the second session, they are 55% above average. It's coded green because we are in the green zone and we are significantly greater than the average amount of change. But take a moment and think, does this graph give you pause? My guess is it probably does, especially when you consider whether or not the change is likely to be sustainable. Again, I'm going to use that green figure. It's not a bad number, 55% above average, but it also makes me wonder, will it last? And in fact, in this graph, a real graph, by the next session, the client scores have deteriorated or dropped. That means I need to attend to the potential for a decline at the second session. And if you've attended the trainings that we do with ICCE, you'll know that we talk about several things. The first one is to simply have the client talk about what the probability or their beliefs are about how sustainable this change is. The second is to ask them to imagine and consider what, if anything, might challenge them in the coming weeks that they may not be considering at the present time. And that is the introduction to this particular index. And we have about 15 minutes left. So if you're interested or have questions, I'm more than willing to try to address them. Feel free to raise that electric hand. If you can't figure out how to get it raised, just wave in front of the screen and feel free to unmute. Yeah, Heidi.
I'm wondering about the first example that you showed, because I also think that success there cannot be attributed to the client. It's too big of a jump as well. Yes, like this on the left hand, the ORS also jumps too high for the counselor to take credit, but the SPI is in the green.
What this graph and what the SPI indicate is that the change is greater than chance measurement error. Nothing would prevent you from talking with the client when they've had a change like this about potential challenges that are coming in the future.
Okay. That's what I was thinking. I would ask the same question about what might challenge this success.
The graph on the right is also of concern, however, and it's because, and what we've noticed in applying these trajectories in consultations around the world is that therapists are much more likely to let the graph on the right, go unquestioned, even though it's 15, 16% below average. And we're not saying to turn this to an inquisition where we're grilling the client, but more an expression of interest. Is there something more? Is there something missing? I don't want the client to think, geez, I'm not doing it good enough for this therapist. I want them to think, wow, my therapist really is interested in finding out anything else that they can do to be of help to me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Nicholas.
I'm wondering if you have tested, knowing this, does it make a difference? Reality for counselors and clients.
We have not tested this in research about whether or not providing this to clinicians and their clients makes a difference. We do know that the feedback in general makes a difference, but that difference also varies by therapist. And the person who's done, I think, some of the most interesting research in this area is Kim de Jong out of Holland, who has found, for example, that therapists who, not surprisingly, have an openness to feedback are much more likely to benefit from looking at the graphs and discussing them with their clients. So I think it's a combination of both. There are some individual therapist characteristics that either facilitate or get in the way. There are also structural issues that get in the way or facilitate therapists using the feedback. For example, session limits, which Nicholas, we've always said we don't think the evidence supports session limits, that there's very little evidence that clients abuse services or go too long. In fact, they tend to go for about as long as they need to in order to experience a change. In addition, when you set session limits, clients tend to stay longer rather than shorter. We think these structural issues and therapist differences can account for some of the variability in response, but we haven't tested these algorithms directly.
Thank you.
Gabrielle?
Yeah, I was also wondering about client experiences because there's a red number. It says with a minus and a percentage. And if you look at the graph, it's a nice example you're having this on. The right graph, I would not be so alarmed, but now I'm more alarmed. Is this something that also sings hope to clients? Is this, well?
So I really appreciate the directness of the question, and this is what we were trying to develop. And all at the same time, I think hinted at in your question, avoid alarm fatigue. We're warning therapists all the time, and then you learn to ignore the alarm because nothing bad happens. But a side effect of the expected treatment response trajectories, these red, yellow, and green zones, a side effect of them is that therapists settle for the least amount of change.
Yeah.
We kind of go, and then we rationalize it as well. Well, they are seriously depressed, so we can't expect much.
Yeah, that's a good
And it's important, I think, because there's two questions here about there's the number, and then there's how do you talk about this with your clients? And that's going to take some practice, I think, so that we don't alarm the clients or communicate or misinform the clients about what this actually means. So for me, at least, when I see the red, I'm hearing that I need to have a conversation and just check, is there anything more I can do? I also need to put that together as the 3-question kind of way of thinking here indicates. I also need to put that together with both the engagement and the outcome scores. So you say, you can see here you're making progress. This 19% figure says maybe if we did some different things or added some things, it could be a bit more. Is there anything that comes to mind? And then I always say nowadays, because of my personal experience, both in the therapy room and just myself, I always say that you may not have a thought that comes immediately to you. If one comes to you after you leave in an hour or two, would you text it to me? And I'd even be willing to have a brief conversation. All of this, in a way, intensifies relationship, really concerned about you, not concerned in a negative way, but concerned and interested in your experience. Tom.
Yes. Am I correct then that this allows you, like the clients above the cutoff have a chance to deteriorate, below have a chance to gain? So it works both ways. It helps you if you're making a difference with clients who are above the cutoff or not, because yeah, you'd be getting warning signs if they're deteriorating, and you would
be getting warning signs if you were deteriorating when you're above the cutoff. However, you can have a lot of variability in scores above the cutoff and still be in the green zone.
yes,
Meaning that your SPI is still going to be green. And the reason is variation or variable experience for people above the clinical cutoff is life. Our moods and our sense of well-being changes from day to day, week to week, month to month.
Yeah.
And maybe here again, core fit skills. If your client scores are going down and you're getting red for somebody who's above the clinical cutoff, maybe your first questions need to be collateral oriented questions. Why are you here? Who sent you here? Since something like 9 out of 10 folks who come for care, whose scores are above cutoff, are mandated into care by someone. It could also be a person, as you well know, who is coming for a single issue or concern. The classic example I always talk about in workshops and trainings is phobias. The client's life, in fact, in general, is quite good, but there's this one issue and concern.
cool.
Thanks, Tom. Alan?
Could you go to your last example for a second? I just wanted you to explain a little bit about the SPI score.
The last example, this one?
Yeah, I think it was when it went down again. When I noticed this, maybe it was the one before this because looked like we had another session. There we go. So when I saw this initially, I sort of expected that would be unattainable in that first, or unsustainable in terms of just the client's scores. Sort of expected that there would be a drop in the second part. Obviously, I was a little bit curious about why the client scored themselves the way they did. It would have provided a little bit of opportunity to maybe ask them about what happened, but also what kept them from going lower than their initial score. We do a solutions-focused approach at our therapy, at our area, and I would have been curious about that. But the question I have for you is, in terms of your SPI scores, your minus 22 is obviously lower than the minus 16, even though it's higher than the original score. Can you explain why?
You're at the third visit now.
Thanks.
And it's such a good observation. I wish I would have pointed it out myself, Alan. The window for a positive outcome is changing from visit to visit. So if you've experienced this pattern of scores, you're at the third session, you have a very minor change in the ORS over those 3 sessions, from looks like about an 18 maybe to a 20, and you've got a decline in the SRS. All of those in combination indicate that this client is scoring significantly below average for those clients who are a success, who have this pattern of scores.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was just trying to figure out, because the client still scores higher than the initial score, and yet and I can't see where on the SRS where that actually ends. Maybe it's maybe it's underneath that green box.
I think it is. I think it's around
I think it might be
around a
green box.
34.
So maybe that's where we're noticing that difference in the score.
And Alan, here's the piece I really love about what you're saying. You're doing what we notice therapists do. And so hang with me here as I try to explicate this, and then I promise I'll let you all go. Therapists, they are hopeful creatures. That's why they're in the business, because they see hope where none is existed for the clients.
Absolutely.
that has to be balanced with reality. So at a therapeutic level, from the discourse between me and the client, hope is a fine thing to have. And you can have hope even in session 3 with this client. But the numbers are saying you need to also be careful that you check with the client. You need to speak with them about this. Don't let hope cloud your view of what's also going on. This client is at risk. So I can hear myself saying to this client, oh, number one, I'm glad you came back despite this downturn. Number two, if I didn't do so in the prior visit, I'm going to say, you know, this also reminds me of something I failed to warn you about, which is exactly this, that when the scores go up at such a large rate, that we should be thinking about what might challenge you, what might give you a run for your money. And so maybe I should have said something about this in the prior visit.
It's instead of congratulating yourself.
Yes, or even the client. And the fact that the client is 55% above average. So if you just do some simple math there, let's say 50. So that's a client with a success rate of about 75% at that second session. Now, just so you know, 40% of clients experience dramatic early change, and they maintain those changes at 2 years. So that's not that the number isn't inaccurate, but it should also make you take steps to ensure that it will be sustainable. And that's the question number 3. Will it be sustainable, and what needs to happen here for it to be sustainable?
Yeah, that's where my head went with that as well. I was thinking about just in terms of being curious about what actually happened during that week, but also what kept them from going even lower.
Yep, perfect.
Yep.
Thanks, Alan. All right, everybody. Thanks. Take care. Thanks for joining me.